NAFI would like to thank AOPA for their generous sponsorship of this episode of the More Right Rudder podcast.
Welcome to the More Right Rudder podcast. I'm Beth Stanton, NAFI's Director of Publications and Editor. This is More to the Story, a series where we dive deeper into some recent articles published in Mentor magazine. Today, we welcome Dr. Victor Vogel. In the November-December edition of Mentor, Victor authored Human Factors in Loss of Control in Flight. Victor is a CFI-I and has been flying for more than 4 decades. He is a member of the NAFI Board of Directors and serves as an FAA safety team rep. He has conducted educational presentations at pilot groups, Sun and Fun, AirVenture, and NAFI Summit. Victor was also the 2025 recipient of NAFI's Greg J. Laszlo Excellence in Writing Award. He recently published a book, A Pilot's Guide to Risk Management and Judgment. Victor, welcome to the show.
Yes, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Victor, in preparation for our conversation, I decided to go back through my archives and sort of write down all the articles that you have written for Mentor. We're going to talk a little bit about the most recent one you wrote. However, it stretches back a long way. You wrote an article called Understanding Spatial Disorientation in 2023. In 2024, you wrote Clinical Aspects of Pilots' Mental Health. That was the May-June edition of Mentor, the medical issue. You wrote an article called Riding the Ark Through the Stormy Seas last November, so a year ago. And we also published an article called Threat and Error Management, which was in the May edition of 2025. You've also written multiple articles for eMentor, NAFI's weekly newsletter, aeronautical decision making and risk management, effective flight reviews for older pilots, instrument proficiency, learning expertise, assuring pilot health and safety. So you have been an incredibly prolific contributor to NAFI publications, for which we are eternally grateful. And I noticed a theme with your topics that you write about, and they focus around human factors and they focus around health, both physical and mental health, which makes sense because you're a CFI and a doctor. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the most recent article that you wrote, the loss of control in flight, and how you pitched it to me and how it actually started as a letter to the editor. I want folks to understand kind of a little bit how the sausage is made here. Victor reaches out and he's like, CFIs need to know about this research study. And then it went from there. So tell us a little bit about how you found this research study, why you decided pilots needed to know about this, and how it ended up being an article in Mentor.
Well, I get a number of emails from a wide spectrum of aviation news sources and publications. And in one of those, they highlighted this research article that was done by 2 universities. And they looked at the NTSB database and basically asked the question, well, why do pilots crash after loss of control in flight? And you can imagine there might be myriad reasons for that to happen. And I'll cut to the chase and then we can back up a little bit. The most disturbing report from the pilots was that those that survived, that is, there are a number of fatal accidents with loss of control in flight, but among the surviving pilots who responded to a questionnaire from this research group, they said that their flight instructors had not trained them adequately to deal with spatial disorientation and loss of control. Many of them said their flight instructors had never put them into an intentional spin or put a instrument or a non-instrument rated pilot under foggles or a hood and then asked them to control the plane. And so the pilots uniformly said that what they needed, what would have prevented their loss of control in flight, was better instruction in how to deal with those eventualities. I'm of the mind that, We flight instructors must train to the airman certification standards. That's clear. But the survival skills that pilots need go well beyond what's in the HCS. We flight instructors are doing a disservice if we don't take advantage of flight reviews and instrument proficiency checks to present scenarios that likely would result in loss of control in flight. So my appeal in that article was that all flight instructors should be aware of this. We should, in our training of either new or established pilots, I don't care if you have an instrument rating, commercial, you're an ATP, you should have recurrent training. And as part of your initial training, you should be taught how to deal with and what the situations are that will result in loss of control in flight.
One of the main things that I appreciate about NAFI membership and the folks that contribute to Mentor Magazine is people come from such a wide divergence of experience. And everybody, well, I would guess most people get aviation related content emailed to them. They look at newsletters, they look at a lot of different sources, but we're all not looking at the same stuff. So the fact that you saw that in the Journal of Air Transportation and that this was this article, that blipped on your radar. I'm sure that didn't blip on my radar, and I'm sure it didn't blip on a lot of other people's radar. So the fact that you brought it to me and said, hey, this is something that I read about, we should really, flight instructors should know about this. So you guys, this is, NAFI is an organization, more than 8,000 flight instructors. What we want to do is we want to raise awareness, raise situational awareness, educate people, and bring information to people's attention. And we do that in lots of ways. And my wheelhouse over here is NAFI's editor, is put it in eMentor, put it in Mentor. So Victor approached me and told me about this. And I'm like, this could be a good letter to the editor. How about you write me up something for the letter to the editor and I can direct folks to this study? Well, Victor, you sent me a 1,200 word long. It was really an article. And I originally was going to put it as a letter to the editor, I think in the last edition, but I'm like, this is too long. This is a standalone article, because what Victor did, he didn't just say, hey, you guys, go read this article. I think it's really important. What you did is you summarized and made a synopsis and sort of did a recap almost of the article, which was really quite valuable and quite, like I said, it deserved its own article. And Victor, it made me think of your article that you wrote, Riding the Ark Through the Stormy Seas. This article that was in last year's edition of Mentor, you did a similar, I'm noticing a theme with you. So you took the Aviation Rulemaking Committee, their findings on pilot mental health. And what you did is you could have just said, hey, you guys, read the findings, which you did refer them to the link to read the findings. But what you did is you sort of recapped and summarized it in a very succinct, easy to understand way. And I was thinking, as I'm preparing for this conversation, this is your MO. With all these talks you do, you have this information and then you package it in a way in an article or in a presentation that is digestible and understandable to the general aviation public. This is, I think, your superpower.
Well, there's an old saying that you can take the professor out of the school, but you can't take the school out of the professor. And I was a medical school professor for 36 years and teaching about cancer, and particularly about breast cancer and breast cancer risk factors, breast cancer genetics, breast cancer risk reduction, breast cancer treatment. And as a professor, you have to take very lofty material that's written by other professors, and you have to make it accessible to students and residents and interns and fellows and junior faculty. And so when I write about aviation, I can't help but approach it the way I approached medical writing, and that is to distill information to its essential and salient features. So the ARC committee had a number of salient recommendations about mental health, and there were 24 of them. And rather than recounting all the protracted methodology of the committee, I thought in that article that I wrote with a bit of a pun, riding the Ark through stormy seas, I thought I would, in one article, list the 24 recommendations of the Ark Committee and use pretty much the language that was in the original report, but made the language accessible. And I hope the pilots who read it found it accessible. And this whole issue of mental health is very, very important. And what I wanted to do was to alert flight instructors and FBO operators, airport operators, school managers, whether they be Part 61 or 141, to this awareness about the prevalence of mental health issues. Now, some of them aren't terribly serious. If your dog or cat dies, that's one thing. But if your mother or child dies, or your spouse dies, or you get divorced, or lose a job, or have a financial crisis, we all have moments in our lives when mental health issues become very, very significant. And what my appeal was after the ARC committee was to make flight instructors more cognizant of what features there are that tip us off that somebody may have a mental health issue, and then to provide access to the many resources that are available nationwide to help us deal with mental health issues. And I was startled to learn in my research about mental health that in any given year, 1 in 5 of us, 20% of us, have some mental health issue. Now, it may be something, relatively minor, like your 90-year-old grandmother dies, but many of us have more significant mental health issues. And the other thing I wanted to highlight was that there have been changes in the FAA medical requirements, and more individuals with a history of mental health illness can now safely fly with medication or with talk therapy or whatever it requires. So I tried to put on both hats, both my physician hat to interpret the information about mental health issues, and then to put on my CFI hat to alert our fellow CFIs that this is something that all of us need to be aware of, need to be able to recognize, and need to be able to help without stigma, without judgment, help those pilots who may be confronting significant mental health issues.
And you've done this more than once. In the medical issue of May, June of 2024, you talked about mental health as well. And what's interesting is the shifts that have been happening over the last few years in the FAA with mental health, and for the good, for the better. I think most people would agree. This is why it's so valuable that we have people like you, Victor, who have a foot in both worlds. You have a foot in the medical world and in the aviation world, and you're able to bring it together. And I'm thinking of how many different facets there are to aviation. I was thinking, for example, there's people who are weather experts. And so they're weather experts and they're aviation experts, and they can put that together. So we depend upon people that have these different areas of expertise to illuminate us, because we all can't be experts. We all can't be doctors or physicians or meteorologists or fill in the blank, all the mechanics, engineers, all of the different facets of aviation that we really need to know about as pilots and instructors. But we can't be experts in everything, of course. So we need people to chime in and sort of illuminate us, give us more depth of understanding, more nuance of understanding. And again, in this world, we're bombarded daily with so much information. We really do need to cut through to the noise. So having people who are experts in the field and can present the information in a very concise and clear and expert way is so important. And so that's what we strive to do here at NAFI, and people like you are help us with that mission. Your talks at NAFI Summit, your talks at you've been preaching to the choir on this for years, Victor. You just NAFI Summit 2025, you spoke on you were a panelist for tell us a little bit about that you participated in.
Yeah, so we had a panel on mental health. The first one we did was in January of, I guess it was 24. Where is Embry-Riddle?
Yeah, in
Daytona Beach.
Daytona Beach. That, believe it or not, that was this January. It was January 2025 because
Oh,
we had
that's right. It was,
postponed it
yes.
because of the hurricane. So yeah, that was
Because
in
of the
Daytona
hurricane.
Beach in January 2025.
And then we essentially repeated that panel in September in Akron. And as a result of that panel, we had several experts. We had Dr. Susan Northrup, the federal air surgeon, on the panel in September. We had Greg Feith, who's a former NTSB board member and still an accident investigator and is consulted frequently. And we had Dr. Tony Reed, who is an aviation medical examiner. And as a result of that panel, I studied the ACS for both private and commercial and looked at the human factors section. And there is virtually nothing in both ACS documents for private and commercial certificates that focuses on mental health specifically. So I appealed to Dr. Northrup after the panel that the FAA needs to investigate how they could improve the inclusion of mental health factors in the human factor components of the ACS for the private and commercial certificates. And then the other thing is that we need to go beyond what's in the ACS in terms of teaching. I'm fearful that there are many CFI candidates now. They're looking to get to that 1,500 hours so they can move on to their airline job. I'm fearful that in that training, not only do we not train specifically to identify mental health issues and to deal with them through tools like the I'm Safe checklist, but we don't present beyond the ACS issues related to the things that kill pilot: controlled flight into terrain, loss of control in flight, VFR into IMC. There's a whole list of conditions that repeatedly show up in the accident investigations that have been there for decades. And we are not, in my opinion, adequately preparing pilots with new and renewed certificates how to deal with these recurrent incidents and accidents that happen year after year after year. So that's included in some of those things I've written about.
Well, I'm just thinking how powerful the opportunity for you to sit down with the federal air surgeon and have this conversation and be preparation for this presentation at NAFI Summit. And you're like, there's really not much at all about human factors in the ACS. I mean, that's a really big deal. And I'm wondering if other people besides you have noticed that, Victor. But the fact that you were able to bring that up to her, and again, there's just a symbiosis between all the different stakeholders in aviation, and you have, of course, you have the FAA, and you have flight instructors, and you have flight schools, and you have flight associations such as AOPA and NAFI and EAA and all the different players. So the fact that people can come together and say, hey, have you thought of this? Or I noticed that this could be done better. Or why is the needle not moving at all on these statistics? I think there's a real power in being able to communicate with each other like that. And so having you there as the person who helped give voice to this potential, I don't want to call it missing link, but hey, let's look at this. That was great that you were able to do that, Victor.
Well, and there is this stigma that the Aviation Rulemaking Committee pointed out. There's this stigma about mental health, just as we have perhaps similar stigmas about alcoholism, drug abuse, all sorts of mental health conditions. And we need to get beyond that notion of stigma and give people the resources to deal with these things.
So you talked about human factors, and I noticed that that's a huge theme in a lot of the stuff that you've written over the years. And when you really think about it, human factors is about safety and about keeping people alive. And you actually just wrote an entire book called A Pilot's Guide to Risk Management and Judgment. And I have a copy of it sitting on my bookshelf. Thank you so much, Victor, for sending that to me. So let's talk briefly about how this book came about, why you decided you wanted to write it, and how it's been going. It just published in October
Yeah, in late October.
of
Yes.
2025. So
Yes.
tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book.
Well, I've been writing all my life. As an academic physician, I wrote hundreds of articles, scores of book chapters, gave hundreds of lectures. And so writing and written communication was just part of what I did. And then I was blessed with the opportunities both in my work to be invited to give talks across the country. And I had the means as a physician to buy capable airplanes. The first airplane I owned was a Beech Sierra, and then I owned a Cirrus SR-22 for 20 years, bought it new and flew it for 2,100 hours, literally from coast to coast. And in those hundreds of flights, I encountered all sorts of things that pilots encounter: thunderstorms, icing, low visibility, equipment failures, radio failures, mechanical failures. And each time one of those events would occur, I would write about it. And so after 30 years or so, I had quite a collection of events that occurred. So with the help of a very useful editor, I wrote the book in two parts. The first part is a recounting of all the flights where I learned significant lessons, where I had to deal with thunderstorms, icing, equipment failures. Some of those were significant. I broke the nose gear on my Sierra on landing once. And then, I went through and I looked at my history, and in 2,100 hours, there were 12 events. So I was having some sort of a failure event about every 209 hours. And so that's the first part of the book. And each of those chapters has an assessment of what the risk was, what was the risk I was facing, and what judgment was required to survive those risks. So each of those 20-some chapters in part one of the book has an initial risk assessment, a recounting of what the flight taught me, and then a judgment about how to avoid those things in the future. And then the second half of the book is really what I believe as a flight instructor we need to be teaching about risk management. And those chapters go well beyond what we teach in the ACS requirements. Things like wind shear, or changing an IFR destination, or creating a personal minimums checklist, or how do we deal with having to change our destination. I made a flight at night once where I was headed to Westchester, New York. It was fogged in, had to change the destination at night and do an instrument approach at night in a single engine airplane with my wife and our son. And so you either don't survive those events or you learn something that maybe could be helpful to others. So the second half of the book it's the managing the risk. What did I learn in all those 40 years of flying that might be useful to other pilots with experiences that they won't see in the training they get, either in their initial certificates or in their flight reviews or instrument proficiency checks? So it's really a recounting of how I got older and wiser. And there's that great old statement: there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old bold pilots. And so I'm not a bold pilot. I am an old pilot, but I think in 45 years, I learned things that would be helpful to every pilot, no matter how accomplished they are. So that's what the book is about.
Wow. Victor, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that background about your book. And everyone who's listening, Victor's book, A Pilot's Guide to Risk Management and Judgment, in the November, December 2025 edition of Mentor, we do have in the NAFI news section some information about this book, sort of a recap of what Victor, not to the degree that you just said, but talk a little bit about the book as well as your article on the book, Victor. You're very popular in this edition of Mentor that came out in November, December. So what I love about as you're describing, there's like almost two parts to this. There's a storytelling part of it. And so, we always talk about hangar flying and, pilots love to tell the stories of their experiences and your experiences that could have gone either way and that are really important for pilots to know about. You did the storytelling aspect, and then you had what I'll call like a solution aspect. Like, here's the story, here's what you can do about it. So I think that's so important to have both parts of that, because the storytelling part of it viscerally engages people like, wow, crap, that almost happened to me, or that did happen to me, or what if that happens to me? It kind of gets people thinking personally about it. And then you're not just telling a story, you're offering solutions, and not just for an individual, but the individuals who are teaching pilots. So I think that approach is so valuable, Victor. And thank you so much for writing that book. And everyone, I would really recommend that you go out and get this book, because it may save your bacon or save the bacon of a bunch of people in the future that you're instructing or flying with. Victor, you've just had such a wide-ranging career and everything you've contributed to NAFI. And as we wrap up here, I do some research for these. I was going through my inbox when NAFI authors write for Mentor, they sign some, I call it fine print, giving NAFI permission to write their content and giving them, it's your intellectual property, but you're letting us print it. And so one of the times I sent Victor the fine print, we were going back and forth. And Victor, I wrote back to you. I was musing how lucky NAFI is to have an individual of your caliber who so generously gives of your time and expertise on matters that many CFIs might have difficulty navigating. Your excellent writing is much appreciated.
That was very kind of you. And, if you look at this analysis, these analyses, multiple analysis in my book, it's not unlike what we did in medicine in a weekly event called Medical Grand Rounds. And at Grand Rounds, a physician brings a patient or the story of a patient, and maybe things worked well. We had a good outcome with a difficult diagnosis and treatment, or maybe things didn't work so well. Maybe the patient succumbed to their illness. And we present those cases to our peers and get input. And I think in many ways, my book is sort of like a medical ground rounds for flights. I took those flights and I analyzed them the way I would analyze the outcome of a patient for medical grand rounds. So it's no wonder it has a kind of a medical flair to it, because, as I said before, you can't take the professor, or you can't take the school out of the professor.
Well, thank you, Professor. We are so lucky that the professor's still there and that you have contributed to NAFI and Mentor and the entire aviation community. This is part of the reason why you won the Laszlo Award this year, Victor. Thank you. And also, Victor I have a few in my quiver. I have a couple more articles that Victor has submitted that have not yet been published that will be published in the future, coming up in 2026, I'm sure. So, Victor, thank you again for all that you've done to help illuminate all of us folks in the aviation world. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us on the podcast. And it's just been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Beth. I've enjoyed it very much.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us for More to the Story. We will see you next time on NAFI's More Right Rudder podcast.